Let's say you want to make a dress like something your grandmother wore, or your great-grandmother, or some other relative, except she's been gone since before you were born. You haven't inherited any of her clothes or any of her other things, and you don't have any photos of her either. What do you do? My name is V. I'm a fashion historian and costumer. I like looking at old clothes as a way of learning about people. But right now, I'm actually about to do the reverse. Look at history as a way to fill in the blanks for clothes. I am recreating a dress like something my great-great-grandmother Carolina could have worn soon after immigrating to the US. She was 18 or 19 years old, she was a Hungarian Jewish immigrant, and she was in the Lower East Side of Manhattan during some of that neighborhood's most interesting years. So making this dress is a way for me to understand and get to know her and her life and her world, which would have been my life and my world if I had been alive back then. And in order to make this dress, I'm going to have to learn a lot about it because great-great-grandma Carolina died in 1927. I haven't inherited any of her clothes. I haven't inherited anything at all from her. I don't have any photos of her. I don't know if any photos of her exist. And I don't even have any family members that I can ask about her. This is where fashion history has to become human history, where you can't separate what the clothes tell us about the people and what the society tells us about the clothes. If you're interested in seeing the whole process, now is a good time to hit the subscribe button. This is part 2 of a 6-part series, and new episodes will be coming out every week. You can also join the SnappyDragon Studios Patreon to support my work and get bonus content like behind the scenes stuff and source notes. Great-great-grandma Carolina came here in 1880, looking at spring of 1881 when she would have been able to work and save up a little bit of money enough to make herself a new dress. It would be easy enough to Google 1880, 1881 fashion plates, the fashion illustrations you see in Victorian era 19th century fashion magazines, except none of those are gonna actually show me what I need to know. Those illustrations are high fashion, really costly design ideas. This is not really useful information for a dirt poor Jewish immigrant girl who came here with not that much more than the clothes on her back and was either doing piecework or working in a sweatshop living in the tenements. The vast majority of people did not have the money to dress exactly like this. Even if you go look at antique dresses, the sort of thing we have in museums from this time period, we still have them because they didn't get worn out. Working class people couldn't really afford to save their old clothes. You wore them until they wore out, and then you made something else with the pieces. One of the only museum examples of a dress I've seen that might be suitable for somebody with Carolina's budget is at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. People who like to make old-fashioned dresses and wear them for fun mostly tend to make middle and upper class clothes, which, I mean, makes sense if you're just here to make pretty dresses and wear them. There's not a lot out there on working class clothes. They're not fun and glitzy and glamorous. There's a dress historian, Marna Jean Davis, who literally wrote the book on working class clothing from the 19th century. Working class people would own fewer changes of clothes. You would have one outfit that was your best outfit. For Christians or Christian normative Westerners, this was their Sunday best. I and my ancestors are Jewish, so that's not your Sunday best, that's your Shabbat dress that you wear for Friday evening dinner and to go to services on Saturday. There is a difference between work clothes and working class clothes. Work clothes were clothes for doing work in. And since I've decided I want to basically make Carolina's new Shabbat dress, her best dress, this new, beautiful American thing that she's gonna make and feel really good about herself, she's going to try to save up her pennies and get a pretty fabric. Even if it's a cheap fabric, still a prettier fabric. I am not normally somebody who bothers much with perfectly historically accurate fabric. I mean, there's only so much you can get because everything you're gonna get today is gonna be made on modern textile production equipment. Something that would have been cheap but felt fancy and felt exciting and felt new and been suitable for somebody's best dress in this setting. We're probably talking about a printed cotton. There's a site, Reproduction Fabrics, that has some reproduction prints from the period between 1860 and 1900. There was one that I liked. It's just like these tiny little two-tone, super simple green and pink flowers. But then there's this other print, and this is the one I liked better. This is the one that my patrons liked better. They're basing it off of 17th and 18th century reproductions. So I don't actually know that this is accurate to the early 1880s, but then I looked at some more references and I got this book, which was highly recommended. This book has swatches of a bunch of printed cotton fabrics from the 19th century. This is various ones from 1860 to 1880, and there's this one which has sort of the similar cream background and the pink and brownish green flowers. This one is a little bit similar, and then coming over to the section that's 1880 to 1910, these are super, super similar to the flowers in the Dutch heritage print. There's dresses and there's things in the reference book. I think I'm gonna go with this one, even if it's a little bit of a reach. It's weirdly less of a reach than that other one would be. Even on these sort of best outfits, you don't tend to see the kind of expensive materials that you see in fashion plates. You're not looking at silk. You're not looking at these skirts that are completely covered in decoration. You're not looking at this really time-consuming pleated trim. You're gonna see things like a single gathered ruffle at the bottom of the skirt. You're gonna see less in the way of decoration on the bodice. Maybe you'll see a little bit of contrast trim. Maybe it'll just be plain. Overskirts were really popular and fashionable during this time period. They're usually much simpler and much less decorated. Oftentimes they'll just be made out of whatever leftover fabric somebody had. It's sort of between two periods of time where bustles were really fashionable. You get the 1870s where a sloped bustle is really fashionable, and then the later 1880s where a shelf-shaped bustle is really fashionable. This is the in-between when people were like, okay, we need a break from massive skirts for a minute. Can we just do something else? I have Isabella Pitcher's Victorian dressmaker book. There's a design in here for a really lovely cotton day dress, really similar, I think, to what Carolina would want to do if she had the budget for it. To make this dress, I am going to need a pattern. In the 1880s, we were just starting to see the first like printed on paper sewing patterns where you could buy the pattern, cut out your fabric to that pattern, and put it together and make the piece of clothing in the envelope. Those were really, really new, and they were really expensive. So I don't think great-great-grandma Carolina would be using one of those. If you had a piece of clothing that was similar to the one you wanted to make, you would just take a pattern from that other piece of clothing. I don't actually know if great-great-grandma Carolina would have had anything really like this. So she's coming from a shtetl somewhere in Hungary. The American fashions are going to be different from what she had in the old world. So she might not have been able to just take a pattern from a dress she already owned to make something this stylish. There were several fashion magazines that didn't just publish pictures like the fashion plates for you to get your design ideas of. You could buy the magazine and it would have the patterns in the magazine. They looked like this. Modern costumers call these things spaghetti patterns because it's so complicated to try to untangle all of those different lines from each other. They were usually single-sized. If it's a one-size pattern, it's not gonna be my size. Even though it's a little bit less like what I think great-great-grandma Carolina would do to make her dress, I'm going to use a drafting guide. Drafting something is plotting out a design or a shape based on some measurements and the relationships between them. So drafting a sewing pattern is taking measurements of a person and using them and a set of guidelines to plot out the shape of a garment to that person's measurements. I have an additional challenge because I have this big curve in my spine, and it means my body is very asymmetrical. I have lots of places where I'm just shaped really differently on the left and right side. That's why I tend to go for drafting patterns. There, I can sort of adjust for the spots of asymmetry I know. Sometimes I've done a separate right and left. Drafting systems started getting more and more common in the 19th century. The amazing folks at Lacis, which is this textile craft shop and museum, found me this book, which is 2 editions from a drafting system from 1880 and 1883, republished with a bunch of supplemental material. And I think this is going to be the perfect thing for me to use to make this pattern. It's not exactly what great-great-grandma Carolina would have done, but it's working from period materials. It's going to get me the right shape, and it's the next best thing. So before we can even take the measurements, even if I'm not like lacing myself super tight into a corset, which most people didn't do, my waist is not going to get a lot smaller. It's going to change my bust measurement. This is a bustle pad. This is going to change the shape a lot. These were worn especially by working class people when they were wearing their more fashionable outfits. 20 inches?
20 inches.
Front length? Back length.
Straight spine.
As if my spine was straight. Back width.
Yeah, 5.5.
Can you measure from here, over the bustle pad, down to the floor?
39.5.
Armhole size.
Yes, all the way up.
These are 19th century armholes. They're actually cut up into the upper arm so you can raise your arms. Let's see, height under arm.
8.
Okay, that's the diagram of the blade measure.
Oh, okay, then 8.
8. Bust measure, which is a totally different measurement than when modern dressmakers say bust measure, is from basically where the blade measure went to the front armhole across that. Breast measure, which is what we call bust measure.
32.5.
That's the one that changes most.
24 3/4.
Okay. We just want to make sure that the tape doesn't go into one of the gaps there if we can avoid it.
38.5.
38.5, got it. This is the drafting system that I'm using, which is an 1880 edition of the Dress and Cloak Cutter that has been republished into this lovely book. Off from 0 upwards on the front line, the distance measured for height under arm. Okay. And sweep it downwards. There's the blade measure, and then there's the back width measure. Here. Okay, there's a back piece. Front length minus back width, 14.5. From Q to T. Drop down 1 more inch. E. A slightly curved center front. This way. So there was a total of like 1 5/8 inches to be taken out in darts. Okay, and there's darts. Well, we have a bodice draft, although it's a bodice draft with a highly questionable armhole. So I think the next thing before us is just to trace this off and cut it out and see if we can make a mock-up. Bust fits, the armholes fit, the neckline fits, the waist is a little too small, but that is, as far as areas to adjust, is pretty easy. It needs to be about 1/2 inch longer than it actually is. I was expecting this to come out much worse. And this is actually something, this is something I can work with. So I need to redraft these pattern pieces to account for the fit modifications. And in that process, I also need to extend the draft down over the hips. I only drafted this one right to the waist because that's what the initial instructions in this book have you do. The fashion at the time, 1880, 1881, was to have a bodice that extended down over to around high hip. Then I also need a sleeve to go with this bodice. First drafting guide I've ever read that actually gives a good sense of like how one arrives at the shape of a sleeve head. All of the other ones that I've read are just like, here is the curve of a sleeve head. I don't know how you're choosing this. This one was super clear about how you determine the shape you're working from, and I greatly appreciate that. This is the easiest 19th century drafting guide I've ever worked from. Now the skirt pattern, I don't think I'm actually gonna take out of the 1881 drafting manual. The Victorian dressmaker book has a gridded pattern for a skirt in it that has fewer pieces. Because it's got so many straight lines in it, I should actually be able to adjust from her size to my size relatively easily by just taking off a little bit of width here and there along the straight lines. In the 19th century, fabric was a lot more often, more like 36 inches wide. Some more expensive things like silk would be as little as 24. If you were trying to save on fabric costs, you didn't want to cut out a piece that big. It was going to be hard to do it without wasting the excess. This pattern, which has 3 pieces, the widest piece is 17 inches cut on the fold, which you can do a lot more easily out of narrower fabric. The other 2 pieces are even smaller. They're not cut on the fold. But I want to sort of stay in the spirit of the project and use my fabric as economically as possible. 5 gourd skirt, 3-piece pattern it is. Fabric is here. I'd seen pictures of it online, but they weren't amazing quality, and I love it even more in person. I like that the print is still like nice and simple. It's a darker background than I thought it was gonna be. It's very much like a coffee stain sort of color cream. I actually like that better. I think it's gonna add to the overall vibe. So now this needs to get thrown in laundry and pre-washed the way I would clean the dress, and dried and ironed, and it will be ready for us to start making the real thing. While the fabric is in the wash, I'm cutting out plain white cotton muslin for mock-ups. The skirt mock-up will become a petticoat to wear under the dress, and there's another bodice mock-up to test the lengthened and altered pattern. This is also my first test of the sleeve pattern. I'm only making 1 sleeve mock-up, so I don't waste fabric. The skirt mock-up, all this is going to be gathered in at the back. I feel like the darts just need a little bit of adjustment. They need to have a little bit more of a like curvy shape so they smooth out nicer. So here's the bodice mock-up. It's got 1 sleeve. This is stuck on my watch. Collar's gonna need to come in a bit more. Way more fabric than I need around the front. It's still quite fitted. So this needs to come up and in, I think. I've chosen fabric, I've drafted a pattern, I've chosen my design references. Now, normally this would be the bit where I would draw a design sketch, except I cannot draw to save my life. I can barely draw stick figures. Fortunately for me, I have a friend who is really, really good at drawing design sketches. Aura Lynn, they have their own YouTube channel, I'll stick a link up there, was kind enough to do a gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous watercolor sketch for me of this dress design. I pulled together all of this design information to send to Aura, and I sent them the design references in this book with all of the little details I wanted to change. I sent them pictures of some little antique notions and accessories that are going to be included in the final outfit. I sent them pictures of the fabric, and they made this. It's just incredible. I can't describe how cool it is to see what this is going to look like when it's all put together in a way that normally I don't get to see because I can't draw my own designs. This really does feel like seeing myself in history, seeing who I would be in my great-great-grandmother's shoes, seeing who I would be and what my life would be like at that time. All of that just in this sketch and in this dress design. Because this design sketch is so well done, it seems a shame to do nothing with it other than scan it and throw it up in this video. So tell me in the comments if you would be interested in prints or merch or something. The next thing I have to do is the scary part. I have to cut into the actual dress fabric, which is intimidating enough for me as a modern costumer who can afford to buy things like extra fabric. And I figure it would be extra nerve-wracking for great-great-grandma Carolina, who had saved and scrimped and might not have that much extra, where if something went wrong, she could just cut a piece out again. The most interesting part of this is like getting into her mindset in that way and remembering what she went through and the struggle she had and how careful she had to be about little things like that. To make sure you don't miss that when it premieres next week, now's a good time to hit the subscribe button and also the like button while you're at it. I will see you all down in the comments section. Bye!